Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on the problem of evil. This is an argument that purports to show that God does not exist by considering the nature of evil and our conception of God. So, the central worry or the central problem which this topic raises concerns the fact that the existence of evil, such as the torture of innocent people or genocide or all of these kinds of events that seem horrible, seems like they are inconsistent with the existence of an all loving, all powerful, and all knowing God. Or another way of thinking about this incompatibility concerns the fact that even when it comes to goods which good people deserve, such as, for example, it seems like there are lots of cases that you can maybe think about good and honest people who don't get, in a way, what they deserve. They don't get happiness or health, but maybe they become very ill and they endure a lot of suffering. So also the suffering of the righteous is another way of thinking about this kind of evil, and in particular the question about why would an all-loving God allow this to happen. Okay, so there are various kinds of arguments that arise from the problem of evil. The first one, and perhaps more popular argument, is the so called logical argument from evil. And what this argument purports to show is that it is logically impossible for God and evil to coexist. Now, again, let's think together about the nature of this claim. In our last class, we discussed quite a bit about the nature of possibility, of logical impossibility. And if you remember from that discussion, we talked about that fact that there are only a few kinds of things which seem logically impossible, right? For example, a married bachelor seems like an impossible object. Perhaps a table the surface of which is entirely blue or orange seems to be an impossible object, right? In the same way, this argument purports to show that the existence of evil and the existence of God are logically incompatible. Again, think married bachelor or square circle. And the argument can be formulated as follows. Premise 1: if God exists, there should be no evil. Premise 2: but evil does exist, right? Therefore, God does not exist. So this is the core argument. This argument highlights the main two features of 1 and 2 being inconsistent. Now, in principle, one could reject 2, and perhaps there are certain philosophies or religions which just reject the existence of evil. But for our purposes, we're going to assume that evil exists, it seems like that is the most plausible option. And so if that's the case, it really comes down to what is in premise 1. Like, what is it about premise 1 that yields the conclusion that God doesn't exist, given that evil exists? And if we elaborate on that premise, what we get is the following set of premises. First, the idea that God is by definition omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good. But the word omnipotent just refers to God being all powerful. Omniscient just means that he knows everything. And wholly good, as you would think. And the second premise is that a wholly good being prevents any evil it can, right? If somebody's good, then presumably if it can, right? This is where the omnipotence comes in, and is aware, the knowledge comes in, of the evil, and they're good, then surely a good person would prevent evil from occurring. This is just what premise 3 says, that a God which satisfies premise 1 and 2 would prevent all evil. From which it follows then that God would prevent all evil because God satisfies these definitions, but evil exists. That is, God does not prevent these evil. Therefore, God does not exist. Excuse me. So now that we can see here the logical argument, the main premise on which we will focus and we should think about is premise number 2. That is, a wholly good being prevents any evil that it can. And the question is, Is that plausible? And according to Marco Rea, the author of the text that hopefully had a chance to read, this premise, at least in this form, seems suspect. For example, there are cases that we're aware of in which a person that is good, or at least that we don't think is necessarily bad, would allow something bad to happen. For example, a surgeon. A surgeon may need to operate on you and therefore cut your skin or make an incision, and that in itself is a damage to your body. It's bad. But they do that in order to do something good. And just because they, again, allowed something bad to happen doesn't mean that they are evil, right? So what this example allows us to do is to precisify, to make more specific the kind of evil that we should think about. And the kind of evil that really is problematic is that a good being prevents evil unless there's a morally sufficient reason to allow it, right? So, for example, a surgeon would prevent something bad from occurring unless there's a moral reason to allow it. And in the case, the surgeon is allowing, or even in that case, bringing about the particular badness of the incision because of the overall health of the patient, right? That's why we think that the surgeon case is fine. So the cases that seem to be problematic are not the cases like the surgeon, but other cases instead. Cases like a case in which it was not, the surgeon did not lack a morally sufficient reason. But what does it mean to have a morally sufficient reason in this case? Here are the 3 conditions which Marco Rea specifies to help us think about what a morally sufficient reason entails. For someone to allow evil for a particular purpose, there must be a necessity condition. That is, the greater good would not occur without allowing that evil. Think again about the surgeon. In the case of the surgeon, presumably the surgery is necessary to bring about the health of the patient. Otherwise, if it was not necessary, I think our intuition about the case of the surgeon would change, right? If it was the case that instead you didn't need surgery and you could have been fine just with a pill, with Advil or something, but the surgeon instead wanted to maybe earn money or something and requested it to work on you in the surgery, then in that case that would violate the necessity condition, and we would not think that actually that's a good surgeon. We would think that that's a bad surgeon or an evil surgeon, because the surgery in that case would not be necessary. So to allow an evil to happen, it must be necessary to bring about the particular good. But there's another condition. That is that it must be outweighing. That means the greater good must be sufficiently outweighed by the evil in question. Again, the example of the surgeon is helpful here. If the cost, for example, suppose that you have a headache or something like that. Maybe that's not realistic. Maybe you have particular back pain, right? Or maybe your arm hurts. Yeah, let's do that. If your arm hurts and the surgery involved just an incision where maybe there's a problem with one of your fibers and it fixes it, then that's fine, right? That's necessary, because apart from that surgery, you cannot be better and avoid the pain on your arm. But it has to be properly weighted, right? Like the incision has to be relatively small or relatively non-invasive, and it has to alleviate like a pretty severe pain. It can be, for example, that the surgeon decides to chop off your entire arm in order to prevent you from being in pain. That would be an evil of chopping your arm off, and it wouldn't outweigh the good of just alleviating your pain, right? Now again, everything is in context, right? If it's in order to prevent you from dying that you need to have your arm removed, then in that case it is an outweighing reason, right? So everything depends about the good in question for which the evil is being performed, the evil or the badness being performed. So it has to be outweighing. The third condition It's an interesting condition, and this is just a rights condition that God must have the moral right to permit the evil in question. All right, and we'll talk about this one in a second. So, with that in mind, what we really need to reformulate this logical argument to get at the precise rationale of what is motivating this kind of argument, we need to think about the idea of a gratuitous evil, or a pointless evil. Perhaps it's even clearer. So a gratuitous evil or a pointless evil is an evil that fails to satisfy any of the three conditions we just specified. And based on this definition, we can formulate the following argument. Premise 1, if God exists, there are no gratuitous or pointless evils. Premise 2, there is at least one gratuitous evil or pointless evil. Therefore, God does not exist. And notice again that in this case, bringing up the surgeon does not actually help, does not actually contradict premise 1, because in the surgeon case, the surgeon is not performing a pointless evil, but actually a useful evil, if you want to call it evil, like surgery or harm. What about this case? So what about this argument? Well, is it plausible? Does it seem? It really comes down to premise 2. Are there at least one gratuitous evil, right? Because premise 1 seems to be plausible. Like, if God exists, it seems difficult to say that God's existence would be consistent with the existence of pointless evils, right? Just existence of evil for no reason. So it really comes down this argument's plausibility, at least in my mind, really comes down to the plausibility of premise 2. Are there at least some what appear to be pointless evils? And according to Plantinga, there are kinds of what you can say there's a kind of potentially kinds of evils that we've been able to explain they help us think about the argument being consistent with God's existence. And this is what's called the free will defense. So the free will defense says that God creates free creatures for the sake of greater goods, friendship, moral virtue. So in this case, it doesn't seem like these are pointless evils, but rather that they are needed in order for God to be to bring about these goods, right? So think about it like this. God creates free creatures, right? But in order, and we need this freedom, and we'll talk about free will a little bit on next class, but we need this freedom to be able to love, it seems, or to be in friendships, or to develop moral virtue. For example, let's think about moral virtue. I think this is perhaps the best way to start. If there was no way for us to fail to be compassionate, like if we were always compassionate, would that be a moral virtue, right? Like, if you couldn't help yourself but to be compassionate because you don't have free will, is that actually a moral virtue, right? And it seems hard to say that would be the case. It seems like we need free will and we need the ability to act in different ways for us to develop these kinds of good-making properties in our lives. So free will is needed to bring about these goods, but free will includes the real possibility of choosing evil, right? Because you cannot have free will. It's almost built into the concept. If you have free will, then almost by definition, you can choose evil because you have free will. And if that's the case, then people will and have and did perform evil actions. But there's a sense in which God couldn't have prevented that, right? Like, God had to allow these evil actions because he wanted to bring about the goods that are constitutive and depend on individuals' free will. And so in that case, if you think about from the perspective of the three conditions for God having a morally sufficient reason, it satisfies the necessity condition because God cannot bring about loving relationships or moral virtue or all these other goods without free will, so it's necessary. And it's sufficiently outweighing, it seems, because love, friendship, and all the virtues of life seem to be sufficiently outweigh the existence of the creation of free will. Notice that this, in a way, says that God is not responsible for the evil itself. He's just responsible for creating free creatures who in turn choose to do evil, right? And that's just a creation. So you have to put on the one side all the good traits that seem to come up from having free will, and on the other side, the creation of free creatures that might perform evil actions. And it seems like in that case, it does outweigh the potential badness, right? And so in that case, it's my apologies. And so it seems like a world where everyone just freely always chooses to do good, it's not feasible for God because free choices by definition cannot be determined. Like God could not have created a world, according to this view, in which only love, friendship, and moral virtue exists without the possibility of free will, or the possibility thereof of choosing evil. So evil, that's how evil enters the picture. Now, one way of thinking about this is that this shows. So let's think about the argument, right? So the argument says that it is logically impossible for God and for evil to coexist. This gratuitous, pointless evil to exist. And what this is saying is that, actually seems like it is possible, right? Because we just saw that this is a particular kind of evil, and it seems like it's possible for this evil to exist and exist in conjunction with God's existence. And so even though all we need to show, or this argument is to show, is just that this is merely possible. Because if it is possible for God and evil to coexist, then it follows that it's not logically inconsistent for God and evil to exist. Like all you need is a particular counterexample, a possible counterexample, not even an actual counterexample. And so in a way, this argument has been thought in the literature to really provide a decisive defense against the logical problem of evil. Because again, the logical problem says that it's impossible for God and evil to coexist. And all you need to do to show that that's false, to refute the claim that it is impossible for God and evil to exist together, all you need is to show just that it's possible. So you just need to consider this possibility. That is it. And so for that reason, the free will defense seems like it satisfies that threshold. But that is just one argument. The next argument, which in a way is more controversial, is called the evidential argument from evil. And according to this argument, if God exists, there would be no gratuitous evil, right? But it is probable that at least some evils are gratuitous. That is, that they're pointless, right? So again, in this particular case, we're talking now about probability, not logical possibility, right? We're talking now about, it seems likely that some evils seem pointless, right? So the burden of proof, my apologies, shifts in this case. Because now all we need to think about are some particular kinds of evils that just don't seem to be compatible with God's existence, right? And according to William Rowe, he brings up what he calls the no-seum argument. No-seum as in like it's a play on not seeing something, so no-seum. And you'll see why it's called this argument. So here's William Rowe's famous example. Consider a deer who dies slowly in a forest fire with no one being aware. What greater good could depend on this? Like, what good can that bring about? It seems, again, like a pointless evil. For a deer to die a painful death in some forest fire, in some, again, some forest that's far removed from people, because you can always kind of think about, cook up stories like, oh, maybe somebody sees this animal dying, and as a result, they are motivated to be good people and help others. And so, in that case, in a way, it ends up being overall a good thing, right? But surely there are lots of evils such as these that nobody even knows occur and that don't seem to have much of a point. Like, and the no-seum argument just says, I don't see a point in this, and I cannot see how this could be a point, right? So, according to Michael Rea, he says Rowe's inference here is, I see no justifying reason, therefore there probably is none. But Michael Rea says we have to be careful with this kind of inference because in some cases it works, right? For example, if your friend asks you, do you have any milk? And you said, yes, it's in the fridge. And your friend opens your fridge and doesn't see it. Then the fact that they don't see it is good evidence that there is no milk in your fridge, right? Like if they look for it and it's not there. And so in that case, that's reliable. Like I don't see the milk, and that's a good reason why it's not there. Of course, that would be different, according to Michael Rea, if your friend instead looked for your milk in your oven, and they looked in your oven and say, I don't see it there. And in that case, that's not a good inference, right? Because they're not looking in the right place. So for this kind of inference to work, it has to first, you have to look in the right place. But second, and perhaps more importantly, it has to be the case that you would have seen it if it were actually there. Like if it were there, you would see it. So think about this, for example. Suppose that you go get your flu shot, which I hope most of you have gotten, that way you don't get sick over this winter break. And suppose that you go to your local pharmacy, and there you have a doctor or nurse or nurse practitioner who is going to give you your flu shot. And suppose that they drop the needle on the floor and then pick it right up and they're just continuing the process of vaccinating you. And you go, wait, stop. What are you doing? There are germs in that needle now. And the doctor or nurse practitioner look at you puzzled and they go, look. And they show you and they stare at the needle for like 5 minutes and they say, I don't see any germs whatsoever. Look, you can't see any germs either. Does that mean that there are no germs in that needle? No, it's just that that's not the kind of thing that you would see if you stared at it, right? So in a way, we're thinking about, is our mode of perception here even relevant, right? And so these are the two questions that we have to ask ourselves as to whether this inference works. Like, is the fact that when we think about these evils and we don't see a justifying reason, does it follow that our inference is good in this particular case? And there's a group of philosophers that go by the name of, or the movement or the literature goes under the name of skeptical theism. And please don't get confused, because skeptical theism might sound like a group of atheists, but no, these are actual theists. And in fact, they're theists who are defending God's existence against the problem of evil. But they're called skeptical theists because they suggest that our epistemic position, or the degree to which our knowledge it's not in a good state where it can tell us whether God has justifying reasons. So we're not in a position to judge whether God has sufficient reasons. And why might that be the case? Well, they bring up a few reasons, and here are the two that Michael Rea brings up. So first, God's knowledge, right, is absolutely infinitely greater than ours. He knows absolutely everything, not only to know about the world, but even things that might not be part of this particular universe, right? And this is where ideas about heaven also help the skeptical theists to think about the problem of evil. But just to keep it somewhat curtailed, think, for example, about the full range of goods that God might pursue in allowing evil. And think about the fact in particular that, I mean, we talked about good things in our first week of class, right? Remember we were talking about hedonism and objective list theory and desire satisfaction. And we're saying, oh, there seems to be all these good things like pleasure and happiness and achievements and friendships and love and all these things. Well, those are goods that we can grasp. But it seems somewhat limiting to say that those are all the goods that exist. Just because we can conceive of any other goods, it would seem a little bit rash to therefore say that there are no further goods, right? And so the skeptical theist says, no, there could be other goods of which we are not aware, the God is pursuing, and they could be good for humans, and he's allowing this evil to occur for the sake of those good things which we are just not able to comprehend. And likewise, even when it does come to goods that we are aware of, we don't know how that particular event fits in the long causal chain of the world. Like, think about even that example about the forest fire. We don't know in the grand scheme of the causal chains what that forest fire actually entails. Maybe that's in part of an event of a much more important event that's going to happen 1,000 years ago, and that this forest fire has to occur. We are simply not in a position to judge whether God has a sufficient reason, just because when we see it, we don't see those reasons, according to skeptical theism. All right, so that is the main response to skeptical theism, but there are other so-called theodicies, and the word theodicy just means literally the justification of God, or to justify God, and they highlight similar but other ways of thinking about it. Now, the difference between a theodicy and a defense is that if you remember the free will defense, all the free will defense was saying, or even skeptical theism to a certain extent, it's just saying, look, you have this argument that God does not exist, right? And like the logical argument, for example, you're making a very strong claim. So all we need to show is that it's possible to tell a story, right? Like, it's possible that there might exist evil, which is consistent with God. A theodicy is more ambitious. It doesn't merely want to tell you a possible story of how God's existence may be compatible with evil. It wants to tell you an actual story that seems plausible as to why God might allow evil. And so in that sense, it's more ambitious and as a result, more controversial. So, for example, one of them is the so-called punishment theodicy. This one suggests that the existence of evils are function as punishments, right? So, for example, sometimes we engage in acts like we imprison individuals, right? Or we fine individuals, which are harms, right? Like when you imprison someone in a jail, you are curtailing their freedom and now they cannot get out of jail, right? So that's something bad, but we seem to think it's fine because it serves as a punishment, right? And so this view views God's allowing evils as punishment, and punishments have different reasons, right? So, for example, sometimes punishments are a way to rehabilitate someone. Again, think about the person in jail. If you have a view of rehabilitation, then sometimes putting criminals in jail or in a place allows them to rehabilitate, right? And to become better citizens. In that case, sometimes God's punishments or allowing bad things to happen to good people, or even to bad people, actually, in this case would be bad people, actually. It'd be to help them rehabilitate. Sometimes it's for deterrence. Sometimes God, for example, may allow an evil to happen so that it deters individuals from engaging in bad behavior, right? Maybe somebody is planning to commit an evil action, but God decides to end their life, which is in itself an evil, but it does so in order to deter that person from acting in bad way. Protection would be the same, right? Again, God may punish someone in order to protect the wider community. And retribution, which is perhaps the more controversial goal of punishment, which is to give the person what they deserve. So people act badly, and so when evil happens to them, that's just what they deserve. Now, the main problem with this view is actually that even if you grant that these kinds of evils that exist are punishment and that they have a justification, any of these justifications, that still does not actually explain the original evil on the basis of which the punishment occurs. So, kind of to give you an example, all of this says that, okay, once somebody performs an evil act, God may allow other evil acts that serve as punishment. But this story does not explain at all why God allows the original evil actions, right? And so in that sense, at best case scenario, this is a partial story of how to explain the existence of evil. All right. Now, the free will theodicy. Again, this one's more like an elaboration on the free will defense that we just discussed. And this one, again, says that God allows both bad free choices and their bad consequences. And the reason, again, is because of the value of free will. But the objection here, though, is why doesn't God stop the consequences, like by always intervening? So even if, for example, you say, okay, we need free will in order to bring about all these good things, and assume that that's the case, well, why doesn't God stop the consequences by intervening? So you might have the free will, for example, to press the button that will lead to an explosion, and so you exercise your free will by hitting that detonator. But why doesn't God just stop the bomb from exploding, right? You have the free will somebody has the free will to pull the trigger and try to murder someone, but why doesn't just God just stop the bullet from doing that? Why the consequences, right? And here the response is that if God always intervened and never allowed us to actually perform any bad actions with bad consequences, there would not be any harms that would actually destroy our moral responsibility, relationships, or moral learning. And maybe one way of thinking about this is, suppose that you had a romantic partner, okay? But your romantic partner, unfortunately, wanted to cheat on you with somebody else. But every time they're gonna cheat on you, God would intervene and would bring them back to get them out of that situation, or bring them back to your house or to their own house, right? They would never cheat on you because God would always intervene. But does that mean that you have a trusting, loving relationship with this partner and that they are loyal to you? Kind of seems like that's not the case, right? And like there's something missing there by God consistently intervening, right? Same with deception, right? What if you had a partner who wanted to deceive you, but God would prevent them from deceiving? Would that be a trusting relationship, right? Or not? And so it seems like, and this is a very substantive claim, that in order for us to develop our moral virtues, moral virtues a little bit more about the theodicy that we'll see in a second, but more responsibility, then it seems that we have to have free will. Okay. Again, this is more like an elaboration, to be honest, of the same idea, and this is a so-called soul-making theodicy that Irenaeus and John Hick more recently defended. And this view sees earthly life as a place where moral and spiritual character is cultivated, right? But according to Hick, virtue requires real challenges, right? Like for example, charity requires real need, right? If can somebody be compassionate if no, but if suffering doesn't exist? Can somebody be sympathetic or empathetic and help people when there's nobody in need, right? It seems like that would not be the case. And can somebody be courageous? Like what? Think about all the other virtues. If there's no challenges against which to be courageous, right? And so it seems like God has may have allowed all these evils to take place in order to cultivate our character and our virtues. Um, Now, one interesting objection here that Rhea brings is, well, if all you need, if this is what you, if the purpose, again, if the goal is to develop virtue, like compassion, like for you to act compassionately, isn't it enough that there are only appear to be needs in a case, right? Like maybe matrix style simulations a little bit over the top, but you get the idea. Like maybe all we need is just for the appearance of needs to be out there and for us to act on those appearances. We don't actually need real suffering for us to become virtuous. Another way of thinking about this is that maybe one way of learning morality or becoming virtuous by reading, for example, stories that teach you like characters that exemplify great courage and compassion. And maybe you actually have had this experience where you read or watch a show and you're taken back by the virtues that are exemplified, right? Oh, wow, that character was so courageous. And so you learn about courage or about love, maybe when you read a compassionate story, right? And it seems like you can have maybe learn about virtues and so on without there actually existing evil in the world, right? Just as long as it appears to be the case. Now, obviously, we know that in movies that that's not real, right? But it seems like maybe a VR system or virtual reality would allow us to engage in if you had a VR system that allowed you to learn how to act and act charitably and compassionately, then maybe that would suffice. Now, again, Marco Rea says that, well, I don't know if that's the case. Again, it seems like an illusory evil would eliminate a lot of our virtues and the things that we care about. Can we really be compassionate if we are handing out virtual dollars to virtual homeless people? Like, is that actually charity? It seems, and again, this is a substantial assumption, that you need actual suffering for you to actually exemplify compassion. For example, you need actual needs, not merely virtual needs, for you to actually cultivate real virtues, not illusory virtues. Okay, so that is basically the kinds of responses that are in the literature to the problem of evil. So let me just kind of summarize. So, for the purposes of this lecture, the logical problem of evil is largely considered solved due to Plantinga. The evidential problem remains highly debated, and again, this is more about Rowe's arguments about whether we are in a position to know whether God has moral reasons, right? And so, in that case, you have the skeptical theist, which is the fourth point actually. So you have the skeptical theism that push back by questioning our human epistemic competence and ask for epistemic humility. And then you have as well these different theodicies, which try to give partial answers, but don't fully explain all the existence of evil. And so in that sense, this is still a hotly debated topic. Well, thank you for listening. And on the next lecture, we'll talk about whether we have free will, and we'll consider maybe some reasons why we might not.